February 11th, 2025. Well, the year is moving along, and we've had a lot of developments. Of course, I've been following a lot of the Trump administration's executive orders, and as we've predicted, they'll be met with a lot of lawsuits, which somehow have to be fielded. But I want to get into a different issue, which is also related and to both two things: the Trump and the Russia-Ukraine war, which apparently some developments have occurred on this area, and that is that apparently there has been a phone conversation, I guess through an interpreter, of between Trump and Putin about the Ukraine war, and as the reports I've got so far suggest that there is a little bit of an impasse going on. Which is about the lines along the lines of what I've discussed in previous videos. Of course, we don't know everything, but it sounds like that basically that Putin was saying that the territories that they're trying to get have been annexed by Russia and are part of their constitution or something. And supposedly the other thing I heard was that Trump was saying, well, they could annex part of Russia, the internationally recognized part, like say the Kursk region or something like that, as part of Ukraine. I don't know what else happened in there. I can think of some things that either side could probably say. I'll get on the flippant side here. It would be interesting if Putin said, well, I understand you want to annex Canada, so why can't we annex Ukraine? Make a deal on that one. I'm just kidding around on that, especially our Canadian friends up there. But at any rate, or even the Ukrainians as well. But the thing is that apparently they are at least talking to each other, which I think is a step forward, because I don't think that there was any conversation between Biden and Putin for a very long time. I guess almost since the war broke out back in February of 2022. And it would be good at least each other gets each other's perspectives. I think that this will be helpful, maybe, because one gets from Trump's public comments that he's been misinformed by a lot of things, presumably by our intelligence community, or alternatively, he's simply taking these positions as a rhetorical stance in order to strengthen his negotiating leverage. Because after all, Trump's general approach to negotiation has come in with a very maximalist position and then get into the fray and then usually work out something, which he hopes to be more than he would have got if he, say, started off with a more minimalist position. And we've seen that, for instance, on the 25% tariff on everything from Canada and Mexico, and then what happened on that. Now, of course, we've just now had a 25% tariff on aluminum and steel globally from all imports. Now that will affect some countries like, say, Canada more than it will affect other countries, but it is on everybody. And so that's but when we're looking at the situation with Russia, at the moment, Russia is just about 100% tariffed and embargoed right now anyhow. I mean, there's anything we're buying from Russia is probably something that we want for ourselves more than Russia really cares to sell it. I mean, and even things, I think that Russia quit exporting uranium to us, I believe. And so, so I don't think that he has the economic leverage he would have over other countries there. In fact, the best leverage he might have would be to remove a sanction in return for something, huh? And that would probably be way too controversial. So at any rate, so that's kind of the way it's begun, and we'll have to see, what that leads to. So if you like these videos, please give me a like. Again, as always, subscribe, and you can click the bell for notifications. Or if you're first encounter me on social media and would prefer to follow me on Rumble, for example, the dash is in the description below. So yeah, that's our kind of, at least we're off to something. But again, the basic Trump position seems to be toward a ceasefire in place. And of course, the Russians, I think, in fact, the weird thing is I don't think either side really is comfortable with that, because neither side trusts the other. I mean, the Ukrainians believe, and maybe the U.S. as well believes, that Russia would simply use that to prepare for another offensive. And on the other hand, the Russians definitely believe that Ukraine would be rearmed during this, and then they might go back on the offensive. So, you know, so that's kind of why I think we have a bit of an impasse. The other thing is that Trump seems to believe that Russia is actually suffering more from the war in terms of casualties than than the Ukrainians are, which I don't believe is the case overall. And so that's in fact, I think the Ukrainians are suffering the most. In fact, very recently, they've been pulling people out of things like their Air Force in order to send them into infantry units in the front line. You wouldn't be, Russia is not pulling people out of their Air Force to send them into infantry units in the front line. So you can see there's a difference there. Um, so, so that's going to be a bit of a hindrance. The other thing is the idea that we seem to be insisting on bringing European, essentially NATO troops into Ukraine as part of the peacekeeping force, which is kind of, from the Russians' point of view, like having the fox guard the hen house, right? I mean, it's and what could go wrong with that? I don't know. A clash between the NATO troops and the Russians, which then leads to an escalation and maybe a war that otherwise wouldn't happen if NATO troops weren't in the presence of Russians. I mean, it's kind of like having Palestinians and Israelis being each other's peacekeeper or something. Again, I've often said that if you want to do that, the best idea I have would be how about a joint force of Egyptian troops and Indian? India being a little closer to Russia diplomatically, and I think Egypt a little closer to the U.S. diplomatically, but they've both dealt with each other as well. So there's enough neutrality there. I think that they would, and the nice thing is they both have large enough armies to provide a sufficient force, actually bigger than say Britain could, that would, I suppose, with us paying for it. But the point is, those people could it could be a neutral observers that would be useful and would not want to get into a conflict anyway. So I think I hope that somebody thinks of that idea if they're going to go there. So the other thing I see is that I don't see any way in which we would agree to have the Russians have territory on the what you call it, the west side of the Dnipro River. That would not be a good. I don't, even though they want elements of Kherson and so forth, and I guess the city of Kherson back in their fold. It looks to me like the river would be a very good dividing point. It might even alleviate the need for peacekeepers, or maybe just some observers. I mean, if the Russians were on one side of the river and the Ukrainians on the other side of the river, that would work pretty good. The problem is when you go north of there into Zaporizhia, and how do you handle all that? Plus, the conflict is ongoing, and I think that Russia still wants to take some additional territory. I don't know how, this is going to be tricky, and I don't know, what's going to happen. The other factor that you need to take into account is that basically the amount of money that was appropriated back during the Biden administration, during that big compromise bill that they fought over for a long time ago, that included a variety of things, including aid to Israel, something like $60 billion for Ukraine, and even some things for Taiwan and so forth. That whole bill. But a lot of that money, I think, has been spent, and a lot of it was being distributed that was left rapidly during the closing weeks of the Biden years. And so that leaves us with a question of, how much money we really have left to spend on it until basically Trump would have to go back to Congress and ask for a bill, which would become a pretty controversial thing, at least in the Republican Congress, right? So I don't know. We'll see how that goes. We don't know. Trump, on the one hand, wants to end the war quickly, but if Russia doesn't go along, what's he going to do? Is he going to try to actually escalate it, or what? I mean, that's going to be a bit of an issue, I think, and he obviously doesn't want to come off on the weaker side, but at the same time, the actual facts on the ground, I think, are pretty much against the Ukrainians. They on occasion, are very good at pulling off a real cutesy sucker punch, like that recent attack they made in the Kursk region that gained maybe 3 miles of territory. But on the other hand, it was at a frightening loss of equipment and men, and now the Russians are counterattacking. We don't know how it's going to turn out yet, but probably won't lead to any great advance. And if they weaken themselves on one side of that area, they might be losing on the other. Um, I will have to admit the Ukrainians have held in there a lot longer than I originally thought they would. I thought maybe a couple of months or three, but I think it's a mixture that the Russian troops that were originally sent to fight them were not the best that they had, and also the Ukrainians committed a lot of their best units to this effort, thinking they're going to get some great negotiating thing out of it, which I don't know what that's going to be, but you know. The other problem I think Trump is going to have is the realization that we're not really seeing this at all the way the Russians are seeing it, and I think since the Russians are the instigators of the active measures, if you will, they're kind of the most relevant to actually stopping it. In other words, I think we have a false perception that the Russians are really in an acquisitive mode that just wants to take Ukraine because, well, they want to take it. I don't think that's quite what was going on. I think that if in fact we had not have had the rather offensive thing going on, and not in terms of direct combat so much as diplomatically and economically, of trying to bring Ukraine into the NATO European Union thing, as opposed to being a neutral country, you know, sort of what's called the Austrian solution, I don't think there'd ever been a conflict here. There are certain things the Russians say that I don't think are quite true. They always have this thing about these defensive missile emplacements in Poland and Romania, which were originally designed against the potential breakout of a missile threat from Iran. It would provide some defensive capability also, I think, for NATO against Russia. But the idea that it's mainly an offensive type of missile is kind of dubious at this point, since I believe that nuclear tomahawks have been pretty much taken out of the U.S. inventory. So, and I think deploying them in NATO rules would probably not be a secret deployment, would have a lot of diplomatic aspects to it as well. So I think they're playing kind of it could be, therefore we're going to make an issue type thing. And certainly on-site inspection, I think, could solve that problem if we wanted to make a deal. So I think that's the way I see that aspect of it. Um, and like I say, the Russians at some point are going to have some, I think, compromise, because I don't really see much likelihood of the Russians, well, totally conquering all Ukraine or being able to hold it. I mean, I think that would give them a severe case of indigestion, actually, particularly when they get into areas that are west of the river. I think that east of the river, I think there are a lot of ethnic Russians and probably be more agreeable to being in a Russian-controlled area, but west of the river, definitely not. And so you'd have ongoing guerrilla fighting that would go on for years, I think, in that scenario. So we'll see where they go and how this plays out. I mean, there is a small chance I think it could escalate, and that would be pretty bad, I think, because ultimately, as I pointed out before, the nuclear issue has been thrown around by the Russians in a haphazard way, and I think, unfortunately, flippantly somewhat, about crazy ideas about, well, they might attack a major city in Europe or something, or whatever, or even directly attack the United States, none of which I don't think they would do as a first move, let's say. Retaliation's different. But where I'm getting to is if there's too much Western military activity that's too detrimental to them, that's where the whole tactical nuclear threshold, which is being much more seriously discussed over there than it was ever before, I think comes into play, largely to be a counter to our superior air power. And so hopefully we don't get into anything like that. I mean, I think there's been too much of this idea of let's fire weapons into Russia. Of course, Russia's been bombing Ukraine, so you got that truth. But I think that eventually you have a risk of escalation. So far, it hasn't happened because I guess Russia's not been hurt hard enough that they really feel they need to do that. But what happens if they do feel they've been hit that hard? And that's where I think it gets into a dangerous zone. So we'll see what happens on this negotiation. At least it's good that they're talking to each other. And I'm hoping that when, like Tulsi Gabbard gets in, maybe we can get some real facts in the hands of our decision makers, that they'll realize what the real situation is there, that Ukraine is really suffering pretty bad, and that we need to do something to get them out of this jam by mainly ending this conflict. But again, the terms are going to be very difficult because you do need to have some kind of verification, I think, or else it's not valid. And that's true. But on the other hand, actually use what are basically adversarial troops. I mean, to bring British in who have actually engaged in facilitating attacks on Russia directly, that's too risky. So I much prefer Indian and Egyptian or something like that. Much more able to, ease the tensions. Anyway, so that's about it for this time. I'll be, of course, posting this on YouTube and Rumble as always, and you can follow me on the my social media accounts, which are in the description below, and we'll see what comes next. All for now.